Welcome. My gosh, time flies. It's 10 months since my last video and time I gave an update on my 5 tanks. About 4 weeks ago I woke up to find that there were eggs on the side of one of my nano tanks. Now inside this tank there were 4 Priscilla tetras, 2 honey gouramis and 2 Cory catfish, and it would appear to be the Corys that had laid the eggs. So I caught the tetras and the honey gouramis and moved them to another tank. And wouldn't you know it, next morning there were more eggs. On the 3rd day we saw a couple of the eggs hatch, but unfortunately the rest seemed to be infertile. On the days that followed, more batches of eggs arrived. We didn't see any more hatch, nor did we see any fry at that time. Most seemed to be infertile, but I'm sure some did get into the Java fern. When the first eggs arrived, I started up a infusoria culture. I did this by mashing up some vegetables, placing them in the bottom of a jam jar, pouring boiling water over them to soften up the cells, draining off that water, and then filling up the jar with water from the aquarium. To this I added just a little bit of yeast just to help the culture get started. And in a few days the cloudy water had cleared and I was able to siphon off some of the clear water for the fish. It wasn't long before we started seeing fry moving in and out of the Java fern. There was one particularly large one which was either the firstborn or the biggest eater. So the main food that I've been giving the fry has been hard-boiled egg yolk, and one egg will last about a week or so, as long as I wrap it up and keep it in the fridge. So basically what I do is I just scrape off a piece, and that's heaps. Add some water. So it's just got to be enough to help mix, and this doesn't want to mix too well. And the whole idea is to break it down to sort of sizes that won't decompose in one big pile and cause a problem, and something the fish can nibble on. I normally try to get rid of some of those lumpy bits, but I think that'll do for now. So I'll just try to get it into areas that are not going to wash away too quickly into the thick of the vegetation. And For the adults, I just use some wafers, which they love. This larger one is the female, and one of the babies. Hiding over there is the smaller male. So the first couple of attempts of eggs were don't appear to be fertile, nothing happened. The third lot I collected most of them and put them into a container, but I didn't treat it with methylene blue or anything for fungus, and unfortunately none of them hatch. So fungus was a problem, and I suspect may have been the reason why there were no hatchings. Essentially, I've been overfeeding the tank to ensure that there is plenty of food for fry of whatever size they might be. My filter system easily handles this increase in nutrients, although for a period there will be a build-up of bacteria and fungal spores. Basically, this is what the eggs look like after 3 days. The viability of them has been compromised by the fungus, so if any were to survive, they would need to hatch on day 2 or be one of the lucky eggs that didn't get badly hit by fungus. If I was serious about breeding, I would remove the eggs on the first day, because they're quite sticky and can just come off easily with your finger. I'll put them into a tank of clean water. Just treat that water with a bit of methylene blue to kill off any fungus that might be in there, and then hopefully they would hatch within 2 or 3 days. From there on, they're quite safe to go back into the tank. Realistically, I don't need any more eggs to hatch, as I don't need 100 or so catfish. Now, this is my collection of fish food. I try to give them a variety of food types just to keep up their interest. These algae pellets weren't really overly successful because none of my fish liked them. Otherwise, you got the compulsory flakes, and these micro pellets are a good value. They're very cheap. My minnows particularly love the bloodworms, and I just cannot get hold of tubifex worms in any of the stores. I presume it's a COVID-related supply problem. Now, the best thing that I have done was to buy a pepper grinder. This is ideal for giving the fish a variety of food. Basically what I've done is I've filled it up with Nutrifix, both sinking and floating pellets. So that's what's in here at the moment, and I can tighten this right down, which means on the finest setting I get very fine food, and that's suitable for the fry as well. That will disperse in the tank. Most of it's sinking straight away, and the floating type will sink down in an hour or 2. And the fish this size can easily eat that. So for my larger fish, I can just loosen this off and grind away and get it larger pellet size. Something I'd recommend buying. Now, when the eggs arrived, I also had in this tank 2 honey gourami, which I needed to move out. So they both went into my large black tank, which is a community tank as such, and they'd been in there 2 weeks, but what had happened was the smallest one was bullied all the time and would hide in the corner, and it just no longer seemed to get on well with the large honey gourami. So I put that into the smaller tank. So I think it's lost colour, lost condition. So I'm trying to keep an eye on that. I just need to decide whether it's worth the stress for the fish of catching it again and putting it either back into a small tank or into the other tank with the larger honey gourami. In my goldfish pond I've got this salvinia growing on its surface. It's a terrible weed that will quickly reproduce and smother the entire pond. So as soon as the spring comes I'm going to eradicate it completely. Meanwhile I'll grab a handful or two just to put on the top of my aquariums. My last video on this tank was about 10 months ago, and I had set it up as a stream tank with hill stream loaches in it. For me, that's probably was the best setup I've ever had for a tank. It was really interesting to watch, and there were always things happening within it. But unfortunately, summer arrived and the temperatures rose, as it had been set up as a temperate tank around 20 degrees Celsius. But the ambient room temperature during the summer was above that. I think that stressed out the 3 hill stream loaches that I had, as one by one I lost them. But at Christmas my daughter was visiting and I encouraged her to have a go at escaping the tank, and this is what she came up with. She escaped it with essentially 2 islands, this small one here, a low path in between, and the second larger one, and this was encapsulated with this piece of wood, and that in itself was quite a saga. Unfortunately I didn't take any videos of it at the time. This piece of wood I found on a wood pile next to the house of branches that I'd cut down from various trees around the property, and I thought it would be really good as a landscaping feature. So I put it aside. In fact I put it in the garage and it sat there for probably about 4 or 5 months, dried out completely, and when I decided to make use of it I pulled it out and scraped all the bark off, and my daughter used it in this tank. But no sooner had it gone in when it built up a layer of white fungus, and that's not uncommon with driftwood and the like, but this was really thick as, and the wood started to deteriorate. It came off in long strips. It was like a banana peeling the skin off. It was just coming off, and each day there would be more and there'd be more fungus, and I was full-time siphoning all the fungus off it and removing those strips of bark as the wood slowly decomposed. Now I persevered with it, and over a couple of weeks, rather than clear up, it just seemed to continue its path of deconstruction, and the water itself became really putrid to smell. It was revolting. It was reasonably clear. I can't say it was cloudy or anything like that, and the fish that I had were no problem. They're still the same fish that are in there now, so it wasn't causing anything toxic to the water as far as I could tell. But given time it did come right, and now it has stabilised, and as you can see it's no longer a problem. I tracked down the branch to my South American sapote tree. The seeds of the fruit are said to have narcotic properties and may have been used by the Aztecs to produce poisons. Extract from the bark and leaves were apparently used in Mexico as sedatives. I actually think the fish enjoyed swimming in the putrid water, as they were probably swimming high. So what I've just done recently, I've added some of the Salvina. But as you can see, it's got new growth already. And what I hope is that it will provide a full cover over the tank to give some more shade and comfort to my main feature fish. And they are both nocturnal. So I've got 3 ghost glass catfish, They had come out of my small nano tank, which you may have seen in an earlier video, and some Cory loaches. And the Cory loaches nowadays hang out down this back area. I've got a little house made for them, and there's a couple of pottery shelters that my wife put in. The main house is one of these little plastic food containers, which I put a couple of holes in, put it on the bottom of the stand and weighted it down with a few pebbles. And that lives at the back of the tank, and they seem to enjoy hiding in there. I added the leaf litter, and since doing that I actually now can see the Cory loaches come out to be fed, because they'll come out of their shelters and hide under these leaves and make their way around the sandy bottom. As far as I can tell, they don't venture far from their little home. Most of the rest of the tank is a pebble base. There is more sandy areas at the back which you can't see from here, but they seem to be thriving. I had boiled the leaves in water just to sterilise them, help with breaking down the cell structure, and help with them sinking to the bottom. When that water cooled, I also added some of it to this tank just to introduce some tannins. 3 of the Cory loaches did not enjoy that change in taste and came out to complain. The glass catfish now enjoy the security of plants over their heads and will come out a little bit more often during daytime. I pruned off the older leaves from the salvinia, leaving the new growth, which is much more pleasing. My wife's toothbrush is ideal for cleaning the curved corners of this bow front tank. Well, my guppy tank just keeps on keeping on. Not a lot to say about it really. I've thinned out some of the guppies by moving most of the males to one of the other tanks and females to another. And I've introduced 3 platies to this tank, and that will hopefully just control the population. I may well do something else with this tank once summer arrives. My fluval tank has become a cold water tank, and I've got a small collection of white cloud minnows. They're quite an attractive little fish. One thing about them though is they do not feed off the bottom, so any food that goes to the bottom needs to be siphoned off each week. There's been no sign of any breeding activity. I suspect that most, if not all, are males. Back in the day, in fact the 1970s, waterbeds were all the rage, and needless to say, in my flatting days I had one. After that novelty wore off, I actually kept the vinyl bladder, so I thought it might be useful one day. And sure enough it was. I'd used it to make this small goldfish pond, and in it are some plants that might be useful in my minnow tank. So I planted this small water lily and this other quite attractive plant, although I'm not sure what it's called. The Corys are at it again. In total they gave me 26 new fish, and that's a number I can handle. Well, I've been playing around testing the water parameters. I bought this pH meter. It's a cheapy one, about 2 years ago, and it worked at the time, but it just loses its memory, and I've replaced batteries and recalibrated, but it just doesn't retain its memory, and now the numbers are just crazy on it. So in the bin. As a replacement, I purchased this meter. It's a step up from the other. Does pH, TDS, EC and the temperature. But the pH, I find the reading is about 1.5 units below what it should be. So how useful is that? Not very useful. My main community tank is growing okay, but I've never really been happy with the growth of its plants. The main problem is I get outbreaks of diatoms, and these cover the leaves and the new shoots, and they just seem to die off. This is no doubt due to the fact that I get my water from a rainwater tank, which is collected from the roof, and various algae and bits and pieces would be in that tank, which would not be a problem in itself. But when you introduce it into an aquarium at a nice warm temperature, the diatoms just bloom. And I've also currently got an outbreak of cyanobacteria. That's the blue-green looking algae type. I cannot help but wonder if my plants would be better if I introduced CO2. It's something I've resisted doing, as I much prefer to have a natural tight tank. So I purchased online a CO2 kit. So back in the day I used to do scuba diving, so handling dive tanks and regulators was no problem. And this is a dual gauge regulator, which most of them are nowadays. The main gauge is to measure the tank air pressure, and there's a washer which will go in there before connecting it to the tank. And that's really, it's not something you can control. That pressure there is really to give you an indication of how much CO2 is left in the tank. Now you can then adjust down here to the amount of air pressure that's going to go through your hose system. And from what I've read online, something between 20 to 50 pounds per square inch is generally recommended. Now I've had no experience at all with CO2. I've just looked at a few online YouTube videos, and it seems to be fairly straightforward. There's a solenoid in here which can turn on and off the air from going basically from the tank side through to the aquarium, and that's set so that when your light goes on, the CO2 goes on. So for my basic plant physiology lessons many years ago, when you've got your sunlight and your plant starts to photosynthesize, it will take in CO2, and as a byproduct it gives off O2, your oxygen. So you basically plug this into your timer for your lights. Now if you don't have a timer on your lights, then you can ideally just buy a cheap timer and plug it into that and set it basically to match the lights on your tank, because at night the plants reverse their process. They no longer take in the CO2, they tend to take in oxygen more than CO2. So they're sort of reversing the process. So you're just wasting your money putting CO2 into your tank during the hours of darkness. So what else we've got? We've got a drop counter that screws on to there, and you fill it up with water, preferably distilled water or glycerine, and that essentially will make it easier to count the drops because they're going through a thicker liquid. And once again, the recommendations online seem to be starting off with, say, 1 drop per second, or 1 bubble per second I should say, and easing it up slightly if you do need more CO2. Obviously be aware it's going to take time for CO2 to build up in the tank. And this supplier also had a kit airline. One thing I've read about your airline is it should be suitable for CO2 pressure use. Your normal airline will not withstand the CO2 pressure so well and will start to degrade after a period of time. Now if it leaks CO2, well, that in itself is not a problem because CO2 is quite harmless. If you breathe it in, it's not going to do you any harm as long as you still get your normal air mix. But if it does develop a leak, then of course you can get water flowing back through from your tank through the leak and flooding onto your floor. So this kit does have a couple of backflow preventers that you'd put in there. It comes with your diffuser, so the airline goes from your regulator into the diffuser and it comes out as fine bubbles. And I'll see online too that if you soak the diffuser in water for a little while before you start to use it, then you will get the fine bubbles straight away. Otherwise you'll sort of tend to get big bubbles, which sort of might be a little bit of a concern, but that'll soon filter down to smaller ones. Now they've got, I can't recall what you call these, but it's basically a CO2 gauge. So you just pour some of the provided liquid into there so that the bubble part there is half full. Put on your suction cup, turn it upside down and put it in your tank, and the air and the water will gas off into this, and the colour of the liquid will tell you whether or not you need more CO2 or less. So if it goes blue, then generally you could step up your CO2 rate. Green, you're in pretty good parameters, and if it goes yellow, then you need to generally cut it back. As I said, I've no experience at all with this type of thing, so do your own research online and become a pro before you try doing it. I see they also supply a spanner just so you can tighten the regulator to the tank. You don't need to over tighten it, but it should be firm enough that it's going to stop any gas from escaping, any CO2 from escaping. Just make sure you do use your washer, and you can always do a test with soapy water around the outside to make sure there are no bubbles coming through it. And that's essentially it. But of course you need your CO2 tank. So I went out and bought a new CO2 cylinder. The company I got it from works on the basis that you buy a new one from them, and when you need to refill it, you swap it over with one of their other ones. Obviously you can't control the condition of the one that you're going to get when you swap them, but I was somewhat surprised that my new cylinder was already about 3 years old and looked a bit battered. I really didn't want that in my lounge sitting next to my aquarium. So I returned it to them and I went shopping for a new CO2 cylinder. There's not much available in this small town, so I ended up ordering one through a brewer's supply shop. Apparently they're used for those people that make home brew and power their kegs. Alas, they didn't have any in stock as such, so I couldn't see what they looked like, but I've placed the order and now it's a waiting game. Well, today I'm back out at the large goldfish pond. Well, as you can see, I've made a start clearing out the salvinia that was a bit of an effort. The water's quite cold, seeing it's midwinter. And I've taken many bucket loads to the compost, and this lot is basically what was an island of floating weeds or floating plants. To remove all that salvinia, I would have to remove these Japanese rush plants that are growing out from the edge. They come out about 40 centimetres, probably about a foot or so from the actual side of the pond, and you just can't get that salvinia out from between the plants, so I just have to chop through and remove all of the plants completely. That would be the easiest way. But of course these plants are taking up nutrients for the benefit of the fish, and if I take out basically all the plants, those fish will definitely suffer. There are also some rushes growing on this far side, and I have to do the same, remove those. That's not such a big problem. So I think I'll wait till the spring. That'll give a chance for the water lilies to recover, and they will then help with controlling the nutrients when I remove the rest of the plants. Well, back inside and with my main tank, and it looks a little bit different. It's grown a new rock. Now this rock I pulled out of the goldfish pond when I was cleaning out the water lilies, etc., and thought it might suit this tank, as this other one here is the same type of lava rock and they might go together. So I took out a couple of small rocks, moved this one in and played around a little bit. So I've now got a sandy area at the back where I can hopefully grow some new plants. I want to tidy up this area down here. Cyanobacteria is amongst that hair grass, so that hair grass is not going to grow, and there are no nutrients in that sand, but I'll see what will happen if I give it CO2. Now I didn't have enough sand to top up this area in the front, so I'd used some black gravel that I had in a tank previously, and I threw some pebbles on the right hand side just for interest, but really I don't like it, doesn't quite gel, but it'll do for now. It's a bit different than before, and it's given a bit of a fresh look if nothing else. I've introduced a few of the Corys, including the mum and dad. And the dad, I'm not too sure whether it's very happy. It's tending to burrow itself into the sand, which is not unusual. You'll find reports of that online, but I don't know why. Maybe it's just maybe it's got claustrophobia and afraid of open spaces. This tank suits plants that have a low to medium light requirement. It is what it is, I guess, but I'm hoping that CO2 will stretch the boundaries and give me a little bit more variety in the selection of plants. But that's another story. Catch you then.